As we look at the next part of Jacob's life, everything gets very messy. So to get to this next stage, looking at chapter 29, verse 31 to the end of chapter 31. And if you look at these chapters in the life of Jacob, everything does get very messy. We're now faced with, in these chapters, bitterness, jealousy, deception, gossip, as a theft, as a cover-up, anger. It's all messy. It's got very messy over these chapters. And perhaps today people might say, well, it's complicated. Where is God when things get messy? Where is God when life gets complicated? Where is God when you can't easily trace his hand through the circumstances of life? Well, he is still there. We've already seen that God chose Jacob and not his brother Esau. We've seen that God has given clear promises to Jacob, including the older brother Esau would indeed serve the younger Jacob. That all people will be blessed through one of Jacob's descendants. And God had also promised that Jacob would return to Bethel, where he'd met with God, a land promised to his family. But at this moment in time, these promises seem a long way off. It's all got very messy and very complicated. But I want us to notice this morning that God keeps those who are his. He does fulfill his plans and his purposes, even when things get messy. And I want us to consider the mystery of God's providence, as one of the Puritan writers expressed it. Now, for you youngsters, and also for us adults, providence, what an interesting word that is, isn't it? It's quite a challenging one to really explain and to perhaps get our heads around. Someone has said that providence is the care and control of God, particularly with regard to future eventualities. But God is not just one step ahead. He knows the end from the beginning. Others have said that providence is where God governs and directs all things. That psalm we looked at earlier, Psalm 57, verse 2. I cry out to God Most High, to God who fulfills his promises for me. It's personal. Providence is the act of God in the ordering of events in order to fulfill his plans and his purposes. Things might happen in our lives. We might say, well, that's lucky. No, it's not. It's a providence and it's a hand of God. So as we look at these few chapters on this next part of Jacob's life, I want to see Jacob's life under three headings. Firstly, a growing family, Genesis 29 to 30. Secondly, a hasty return, Genesis 31. And then we have a solemn promise, Genesis 31, or a serious promise there, Genesis 31, to the end of that chapter. So firstly, a growing family. The events of Genesis 29, verse 21, and the following verses, they have started within the 7 years that Jacob had already married Rachel. He married her, then working for another 7 years. And it's probably in that time that all these things begin, during those 7 years. And as we found out last time, Jacob is now married to 2 wives, and they're both sisters. And in fact, the fact is not hidden at all that his favourite is Rachel. And if we were to look at verse 31, it simply says Leah was not loved. Awful situation. Leah was not loved. And when God saw that Leah was not loved, God made it possible for her to have 4 sons: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. And when Rachel saw that her sister was bearing sons and that she was not able to, she became jealous and she became desperate. Give me sons, she said to Jacob, or I'll die. Very difficult time for Rachel. Very, very trying, very hurtful, very difficult time for Rachel. She was so desperate that she gave her maidservant Bilhah as a 3rd wife to Jacob, who then bore 2 sons on Rachel's behalf, Dan and Naphtali. And we're then told that sometime later, Leah gives birth to a daughter called Dinah. So, a total of 10 sons and 1 daughter that we're told about. There's so much hurt. It seems such a mess, we might think. These children, these wives of Jacob. And then we get to Genesis chapter 30 and verse 32. Then God remembered Rachel, and Rachel herself bore Jacob a child, and they called him Joseph. Now, there's no mention of Benjamin at this point, because Benjamin doesn't get born until chapter 35. So Benjamin has not yet been born. And though there is so much hurt, so much jealousy, so much pain, we read that God was still there amongst all that was going on. He saw what was going on, and he remembers Rachel. The mystery of God's providence still works in our messy lives. In the providence of God, Jacob's family is growing. And God is ordering events so that weak and sinful actions of people like us, to fulfill his plans and to fulfill his promises. Now, is that a good reason to keep on living a life with no regard to God? No, not at all. But it's not just the members of Jacob's family that were increasing. He was now going to have his own flocks of sheep, his own flocks of goats. See, up until now, Jacob had worked for his father-in-law, and he looked after his father-in-law's flocks of sheep and flocks of goats. But as the custom was at this time, Jacob, his wives, and his children remained in many ways the property of the father's house, of Laban's house. He was like his property. It was his household that Jacob and his family were part of at this time. But significantly, that was now going to change. But Jacob couldn't leave his father's house to establish his own household without the father's permission. And it's as if the birth of Joseph to his beloved Rachel sparks some interaction. And what does Jacob decide to do? Chapter 30 and verses 25 and 26. After Rachel gave birth to Joseph, Jacob said to Laban, "Send me on my way so that I can go back to my homeland. Give me my wives and children for whom I have served you, and I will be on my way." There's no mention of sheep, no mention of goats. Just let me take my family and go back home. But Laban says in verse 31, 27 and 28, "Please stay. Name your wages and I'll pay. Please stay. You know that the Lord has blessed you wherever I have been," said Jacob. "When can I do something for my own family?" "What shall I give you?" Laban said. "Well, don't give me anything, but will you do this one thing for me? Today, let me go through your sheep and your goats and take out any that are speckled or spotted, and I'll take them for myself. Then you'll know that I haven't tricked you, haven't deceived you, because if I have a sheep or goat all white, you know it's yours and you take it." Laban agrees, but with more deception, more dishonesty. Immediately, he removes all the speckled, all the spotted sheep and goats from his flocks, gives them to his sons and say, "Right, take them away. Take them 3 days' journey away, so Jacob can't find them. He can't take those." And then through this bizarre process, I looked at commentators. They've all got different views of what's going on here. So what happened here? He had these 3 types of trees. You've got the poplar, almond and plane trees. And he peels part of the branches so some of the white is seen. And it's placed by the watering troughs in the eye line of the sheep. And that's during the mating season. And that causes the stronger animals in the flock to exhibit these speckled and spotted marks. And as one commentator said, scientifically unexplainable. What if by simply looking at these things, how could it have an effect on the young that are born? The result was that Laban ended up with all the weak animals, and Jacob had the stronger ones. But I think a bit later on there's a hint of what might be going on there. Now, some have suggested, I'll give you one thought, that by placing these peeled branches in the eye line of the sheep during the mating season, it particularly drew the attention of the few speckled and spotted sheep. So that drew their attention, then those mated together, that produced more of that type of sheep and goats. That may be the case. I'm not sure we've got any definitive answer as to how the system worked, but wait a bit later on. There might be an idea of what's happening here a little bit later on. Now, today, we do have what's called Jacob sheep, and you can see that is a Jacob sheep. Fantastic, isn't it? Brown, speckled, sheep we see there. Then in Genesis chapter 30, verse 43, whilst all this has been taking place, we're told this: in this way the man, Jacob, grew exceedingly prosperous and came to own large flocks and maidservants and menservants and camels and donkeys. Now, having said that, it's not totally clear how Jacob acquired the maidservants, the menservants and the camels and donkeys, but he certainly did. He's becoming a very wealthy and a prosperous man. Jacob's family is now being established as a wealthy household in its own right. So through God's providence, the promise made to his grandfather Abraham, then passed down to his father Isaac, and now passed down to Jacob himself, is being fleshed out. Jacob's family is now a significant household, ready to return to the land promised by God. God's work of providence can work unseen through the mess of life. God is still ordering events in order to keep his promises and to fulfill his plans and promises, but to fulfill his plans and promises for you. Secondly, a hasty return. Genesis 31, 1 to 21. Sorry, I have to say these visuals are a little bit different, actually. Couldn't find the same visuals for the whole thing, so you may spot the visuals are a little bit different. Now, as Jacob became wealthy, as he became rich, he hears that Laban's sons are talking about this developing situation, that Jacob has taken everything that belonged to their father. He's now got it. Now, obviously, their thoughts are no doubt on their dwindling inheritance. It's now all going to Jacob. Then God spoke to Jacob and said to him in chapter 31, verse 3, Go back to the land of your fathers and to your relatives, and I will be with you. God had been keeping his promise to always be with Jacob. You might remember that was one of the promises that God gave to Jacob in that vision when he met God in Bethel. I will be with you until I bring you back to this place. And God had been keeping that promise to Jacob. And he's now confirming that he would continue to do so until Jacob returns home. So Jacob sends a message to Rachel and to Leah to meet him in the fields where the flocks are. He doesn't want anyone listening in to this conversation with his wives, and he speaks to them. But he doesn't start by telling them what God had said. He explains what life had been like living with their father and how Laban had treated him, changing his wages 10 times in chapter 31, verse 7. But he made it quite clear to his wives that God had still been with him. Through all the mess, through all the uncertainty, God has still been with him. Furthermore, it was God who had taken away their father's livestock and given them to Jacob. In chapter 31 and verse 9, we read these words. So God has taken away your father's livestock and has given them to me. Now, some people think that is implying that in some way God was involved in the process Jacob used to cause the sheep and the goats to become speckled and spotted. In some way God was involved in that process. That's why perhaps scientifically is unexplained, because in some way God was working in that process so that Jacob would have all the speckled and the spotted sheep, and that would be the stronger and the greater part of Laban's flocks. And in fact, in the New Bible Commentary, of which Don Carson is one of the editors amongst others, that is the line they suggest, that God is behind the process of stripping those branches and that whole process of the sheep and the goats becoming a greater number of spotted and brown sheep. So he increases the size of the flock that he has, and he shares this all with his 2 wives outside where no one can hear him. Finally, Jacob tells them what God had said to him. In Genesis chapter 31, verse 13. I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar and where you made a vow to me. Now leave this land at once and go back to your native land. And Rachel and Leah replied by saying that their inheritance that they wouldn't have from their father has now been given to Jacob. So therefore, do whatever God tells you to do. Straight away, they pack, ready to leave. But they do not tell Laban. They get all their things together. It's a large family. They get all their things together. They pack, ready to go, but they do not tell Laban. Laban does not know Then Jacob put his children and his wives on camels, and he drove all his livestock ahead of him, along with all his goods and all that he had accumulated in Paddan Aram, to go to his father Isaac in the land of Canaan. God's providence works in ways we don't always see. We don't always understand, but God nonetheless requires our complete obedience. We may not understand, but we obey God. He has his plans, he has his intentions, and he'll always fulfill them. That's why that regular daily time with God in his word and in prayer is so important, and it's so significant. If we're not speaking to God or hearing him speak through his word, how do we know what he wants us to do? Then with God's help and enabling, we are to obey God as he orders events, to keep his promises and to fulfill his plans and purposes. But then Rachel does something we might think is out of character. In verses 19 to 21, she steals her father's household gods and hides them. We think, well, what are they doing with those? What is the situation here? It mentioned earlier on about Laban through divination. Some think she took them to cleanse her father's house of false gods. But if that was the case, why didn't she then throw them away? She kept hold of them. Most writers seem to suggest that Rachel still kept some of her Syrian superstitions, and that she viewed those household gods as a sort of charm, protecting them on their journey to a foreign land. So it would appear that she didn't totally trust herself into the hands of the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and of her husband Jacob. She didn't fully put herself in the hands of God. And sometimes when we don't understand what God is doing, we can struggle to trust him. Now, for some people, when you think of aeroplanes, and you think, I don't understand how it stays in the air. I don't understand how it flies. And therefore we feel nervous. We don't trust him. We don't understand how it works. Sometimes with God, we don't understand what he is doing. We don't understand the circumstances of our life. We don't understand what's taking place. And therefore we struggle to trust him. And that can be very, very hard for us. But as Psalm 57 verse 2 reminds us, I cry out to God Most High, to God who fulfills his purposes for me. God is still trustworthy, even if we don't understand what he's doing. He is still in control. He still has his intentions and his purposes, and he will fulfill them. Thirdly, and finally, we have here a solemn promise, or a serious promise here in Genesis 31, verses 22 to 55. On the third day since Jacob and his family have left, taking all those things with him, Laban is told. He is told that Jacob and his family have fled. So immediately he goes over after them. He chases them. He wants to find them. He wants to catch up with them. But God comes to Laban in a dream and warns him, do not say anything good or bad to Jacob. When you catch up with him, make sure you do not say anything good or bad to him. Laban finally catches up with Jacob. And read in chapter 31, verses 26 to 29. We read this. Then Laban said to Jacob, what have you done? You've deceived me, and you carried off my daughters like captives in war. Why did you run off secretly and deceive me? Why didn't you call me so that I could send you away with joy and singing to the music of tambourines and harps? You didn't even let me kiss my grandchildren and my daughters goodbye. You have done a foolish thing. I have the power to harm you, but last night the God of your father said to me, be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad. Now you have gone off because you long to return to your father's house. But why did you steal my gods? Jacob replies that he was afraid, because he thought Laban would come and take his daughters by force. Tensions are building between Laban and between Jacob, with Laban accusing Jacob of stealing his household gods. But you see, Jacob knew nothing about this. Jacob didn't know what Rachel had done. He's in the dark. Laban searches for his household gods, but Rachel's hidden them, so he doesn't find them. Now, Jacob is angry. He's angry with Laban, verse 36. See, I told you we never had it. What's the way forward for Laban and for Jacob? They're at loggerhead. Where do they go from here? Laban then speaks. Genesis chapter 31, verses 43 and 44. Laban said this. Laban answered Jacob, "The women are my daughters, the children are my children, and the flocks are my flocks. All you see is mine. Yet what can I do today about these daughters of mine, or about the children they have borne? Come now, let's make a covenant, you and I, and let it serve as a witness between us." The place where they make this covenant, this oath, this promise, it's got a number of names you might notice in the Bible. One of which is Mizpah. So this took place in what we now know is called Mizpah. And Mizpah means, may God keep watch. May God watch over us, Laban said. And Jacob, make sure you treat my daughters well, because God sees. God sees when no one else is around. Laban then promised not to go beyond that point to attack Jacob. And Jacob promised not to go beyond that point, Mizpah, to attack Laban. They all have a meal together, a big family meal. They're all together having a big family meal, and they spend the night together there in Mizpah. And then, in verse 55, we read this. Early next morning, Laban kissed his grandchildren and his daughters and blessed them. Then he left and returned home. Very moving, isn't it? This promise, this covenant, this solemn promise had been made, and he can now say goodbye to his daughter and his grandchildren, and he goes back home. You see, God's providence can be a mystery. That's what a famous Puritan book is called, The Mystery of God's Providence. The events God orders to keep his promises, the events God orders to fulfill his plans, the events God orders to fulfill his purposes for us may not make sense to us, but they do to God. At this point now, Jacob, at long last, is on his way back to Bethel with his household. He's returning home. But there's someone he's going to have to face when he gets back. And that's Esau. But that's for another time.